Hello, this is Mel Thompson, and this is a podcast and a series of podcasts about political risk. Today I'll be discussing EU border controls and how these border controls impact market entry. The European Union is at the cusp to tighten the border controls that they already have in place, if you want to call them controls at all. The EU was pretty much a organization that was founded upon openness, open borders, a common currency, somewhat similar to a United States of Europe. I'm not sure if they like the terminology. I'm not sure if people are offended by that. If they are, I apologize. But it's probably the most accurate way to describe what they were aiming for. And really, who could argue with open borders and a common currency and people trying to work together for the common good? Well, I'll tell you who could argue with that. Everybody who doesn't like open borders and common currency. And the problems were not manifested until recently when you started to have this horrible refugee crisis. Because of this crisis, you now tend to see certain EU nations tightening up their borders, doing things that are pretty much un EU like, if you will, for lack of a better way to phrase it. And now all of a sudden, the EU seems to be trying to step into the shoes of individual members by collectively getting a policy in place that will tighten the border controls. How this impacts foreign direct investors and companies is pretty straightforward. With border controls, you will have a slowdown in transportation. You will also have a slowdown in market entry rules because there are going to be several other hoops you're going to have to jump through, probably, more than likely pertaining to permits. These are very, very obvious things, very common things. They're not that much of a big deal, but they're part of the process. Any process that involves a market entry procedure is always going to have some degree of checking, double checking, and assuring that you are who you say you are, that your products and services are what they claim to be, and that they are even allowed in the particular host nation in question. Now, I'll give you an example of how this somewhat came to be, mainly because it needs to have a little bit of background. Now, Greece, as we all know, has done a fabulous job as far as taking people in. Their people are literally landing in Greece, and the local citizens where these people land are taking them in as if they were their family. They've done everything they possibly can. Greece cannot do it alone. Greece already has a tremendous amount of economic problems, so therefore the people need to be moving north, east, wherever they want to move, in an effort to settle in Europe. Because Greece has been so open-minded, done the right thing by these refugees, the refugees now are going to be paying a price because a lot of these European countries were totally unprepared for an influx of this nature. And yes, there is a certain degree of xenophobia involved in some of these nations, as in all nations. But the biggest problem you're going to see now economically is not the issue of taking in refugees and resettling them and getting them integrated into society. The biggest problem that I see is the overall economic impact of border controls on the economies of the EU nations that really didn't have these types of controls previously. How will this impact the overall economies of these nations long term is yet to be determined. No one knows, no one can see into the future. But I will tell you that when you start looking around at nations globally, any nation, including the United States, and you start looking at policies and procedures when it comes to borders, you will see that there are procedures and processes that do take time. They impact transportation, they impact the contractual relationships, they impact a lot of elements that pertain to time. Time is of the essence in many cases in the risk world, and when you start dealing with timing and contracts that are already in place, you interject an element of political risk that did not even occur to anybody previously, nor was it even a consideration, even if the long-term analysis said there could be a border control issue in the future. In other words, the risk mitigation analysis that would have led someone to the conclusion that there could possibly be some border control in the future within the EU was never contemplated. Why would it have been? This was not what their plan was, and it has never ever been a problem or an issue. Now they have this horrific war in Syria on their border, and it's coming towards them in the form of refugees. No one saw that coming. No one saw a lot of things coming. Now that it's here, you need to understand that current contracts are also subject to problems time-wise, supply chain-wise, that were never contemplated initially because of the open border policy in the EU. This has been Mel Thompson.